Welcome to EPG Pathshala. We are going to be talking about the course on social policy, and the module under discussion at present is social protection. My name is Sohini Sengupta and I am an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Social protection may be defined as all public and private initiatives that provide income or consumption transfers to the poor, to protect the vulnerable against livelihood risks, and enhance the social status and rights of the marginalized. Overall objective of social protection is to reduce the economic and social vulnerability of the poor and marginalized groups in the society. All of this discussions and descriptions of social protection sounds very close to social policy. What we will do in this module, and we'll try to understand, is where does social protection fit within the broader umbrella of social policy. The objectives of this particular module is to discuss with you conceptual frameworks of social protection, to introduce to you to the concept of transformative social protection and how it is different from other rival frameworks. We will also discuss the relevance of social protection in the context of development in the contemporary context. What does social protection do? Social protection, according to a recent ILO report 2014, social protection helps to enables people to attain their human rights in social security, to reduce poverty and inequality. It also supports economic growth. Now that is why we say that social protection is key not just to social policy, but it is also a key instrument in economic policies of many countries today. How does it support economic growth? It supports economic growth by boosting the building of human capital, by increasing the productivity of people, basically people who would be working in the economy and contribute their labor and their skills and their knowledge and their abilities. It would create domestic demand. If people have sufficient income, they would also be spending more money, which would lead to domestic markets in goods and commodities to grow. It can also help to transform structurally national economies if they're wanting to go away from a particular way of life to another way of life on the basis of economies. Lack of social protection is viewed as a major obstacle in present times to economic and social development, because the logic goes that if you have a population that is too poor, that does not have enough skills, that hasn't completed 15 years of education, the right kind of education, that is constantly suffering from all kinds of inabilities to perform, then that society cannot possibly progress, or it will not lead to development. While social protection, therefore, has emerged as a key development agenda, the fear is, or the ILO and other international bodies fear, that fiscal policies that many countries are adopting at present might lead to social protection programs being contracted, because there is simply not enough finances, not enough money to fund social protection programs. So that is the inherent risk. So on one hand, we are saying, let us do more social protection, because that would lead not only to the well-being of people, but to the well-being of economy. On the other hand, we are saying, but does the economy permit us to spend enough money to create these social protection programs? The ILO report also provides us with some global data about social protection coverage in the world today. And what skews this data essentially is that quite a lot of the countries that in the past were called developed countries and today are also known as high-income countries, a lot of the population, a larger share of the population have such coverages, social protection coverage, whereas in the rest of the world, which are called low-income or middle-income countries or developing countries in the past, located in the south of Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Latin America, large proportions of population actually do not have access to such coverage. So when you average it out, it does look better than what the reality would be, say for instance, in South Asia context or in the context of India, for example. Globally, if we look at the figures, only 28% of the labor force is eligible for unemployment benefits. So basically, if you lose your job, nobody pays you anything. You simply don't have any income. Less than 40% of women in employment are covered by maternity scheme. It essentially means that for the other 60% of the women who are working in different spheres of life, maternity does not lead to any kind of special protection that the government or any other agency provides to them. 48% of the people over pensionable age, which means the elderly population, do not receive any kind of pension, which essentially means more than half the elderly population in the world, and this is a global average. The proportions are much higher in developing countries, basically have no jobs, no earnings, and no protection in case of old age. 90% of population living in low-income countries lack health coverage protection, which essentially means they spend large amounts of money out of their own pocket for meeting healthcare needs. In our module on health policy, we will be discussing some of these issues about healthcare and healthcare expenditure in more detail. 40% of all health expenditure in the world is paid by the sick people themselves. Now, we don't know whether these sick people are actually being able to go to their work, being able to earn their incomes. If they have to forego their incomes, where is the money coming from to pay the bills of healthcare? And does it mean that they forego other needs when they pay for healthcare? Now, social protection is often described very broadly in terms of 3 Ps. What are these 3 Ps? It has 3 basic functions. It is supposed to protect people from hardship following poverty, right? So if you are a non-poor person, if you are not poor and you suddenly find yourself in a situation of poverty, then there is some measure, or there is some mechanism which will take care of the life that you're going to be leading now, a deteriorated standard of living now that you're a poor person. Preventing people from falling into poverty in the first place, you ensure that there's enough checks and balances in your economy and your society that people don't become poor in the first place. It also aims at promoting people out of poverty. So if you have a society where people have been chronically poor for generations, we'll create mechanisms so that some of them are not so poor, or their children are not poor in the next generation. So protection, prevention, and promotion are the 3 Ps which are used to describe social protection's functions in general. There are also several frameworks, which means that not everybody agrees. While everybody might agree that social protection is a great strategy to protect people so that they can perform well in economy and society, but not everybody agrees on how to do it. So there are 5 frameworks that we have selected out of the vast literature on social protection that is proliferating out there, and which you are welcome to read. Let's discuss these 5 frameworks that we have selected for you, because these are influential frameworks. The first one is social risk management. Social risk management is a framework that has been developed by the World Bank, and it highlights that poverty and vulnerability as uninsured risk, and hence ensuring the risk will contribute towards poverty reduction. This is a very, very, very different way of understanding the contingencies of people's lives in terms of the risks that they encounter. Risks almost make them appear like they were investors in the stock market, and we know stock market investors do have a lot to lose, but they don't necessarily have the kind of things to lose that people who are in poor health, or who are old, or who are dying have to lose. So there's a subtle difference in the kind of risks involved in being poor as against being a stock market player whose stocks have taken a nosedive. Social risk management, however, is a very influential framework. It is so influential that we are going to have a module which is entirely about social risk management. So we will not talk about it anymore out here. Let us look instead at transformative social protection. What does that mean? Transformative social protection focuses on provisioning, preventing, and promotive measures, like we mentioned. It's more comprehensive. It aims to provide more comprehensive protection to all types of social and economic risks, and reconceptualizes the notion of vulnerability as a byproduct of existing social and political context. which essentially means it does not attribute the risks that people face in their lives merely in terms of individual characteristics or their behavioral characteristics or any action that they may have undertaken, but tries to look at social and economic risks as a byproduct of macro processes or larger processes taking place in the society and in the economy in general. The third framework is called the asset threshold framework. In our country, in India, we sometimes make social protection programs based on a framework, asset threshold framework. According to this framework, there exists a level of asset holding above which people can invest productively, accumulate in advance, but below which people are in a poverty trap. It essentially is a concept similar to the poverty line that we had discussed in a previous module, which essentially means that a certain level of social economic capital or property, it means that people are well able to handle the kind of social and economic risks that life might throw at them, whereas people below a certain asset level are unable to. So social protection programs hence should be targeted towards those people who are below a certain level of assets. The POVNet approach is another framework, a more comprehensive framework that was developed by the POVNet team that focused on poverty reduction strategies based on multidimensional understanding of poverty and vulnerability. And what they do is they combine social protection with other strategies like economic opportunities and inclusion. So what this group believes is that social protection in itself is not enough. It can only paper over the risks temporarily. What one needs to do is create opportunities in the economy so that people are able to benefit from the growth or the development that is happening. Universal social minimum is the fifth framework, which can be understood as resources, opportunities, rights and power to lead an adequately decent and dignified life and to participate and advance as free and equal member in society. Universal social minimum is a framework that encourages policymakers to provide a basket of minimum goods and services to all, irrespective of whether they are experiencing any kind of shortfall in their living standards or not. And hence, one of the recent debates that is taking place about giving everybody in the world a universal basic income is based on a notion of universal social minimum. We will focus in this module essentially on transformative social protection because this is broad and comprehensive enough to encompass the ideas that are present in the other types of framework. This is of course another reason why we include this framework is also because it's the most progressive and it seems to have incorporated the broader philosophical concepts of rights, justice, redistribution, etc. better than the other frameworks. This approach is associated with the Institute of Development Studies group based in Sussex in United Kingdom, and they have identified 4 key instruments for social protection. Provision measures, which essentially means that when people are in distress, you provide immediate relief from deprivation by narrowly targeting social safety nets, which measures include social assistance for the poor. So all social protection measures must have some amount of provisioning, which essentially takes care of those who are at maximum risk and who require immediate support or immediate help. Essentially, this translates into poverty relief type of programs. Preventive measures. Poverty alleviation through measures such as social insurance programs, such as formalized systems of pension, health insurance, maternity and unemployment benefits, are long-term protection mechanisms that are extended to large sections of the population, and you don't wait for them to be in extreme distress. Preventive measures is the other strategy that transformative social protection requires, that all societies should also create a framework, a barrier of preventive measures. Promotive measures are aimed at improving real incomes and capabilities through a number of development initiatives, but especially livelihood program, especially in countries where a lot of population, a large number of people are employed in sectors like agriculture and other informal types of work. Creating real incomes is a challenge which must be addressed if one really wants to improve well-being in society. Promotive measures, remember, aimed at promoting people out of conditions of deprivation, generalized conditions of deprivation to which many people might be adapted. These are also people in this situation who can become distressed quite suddenly at any slight shock. Hence, promotive measures are aimed at creating real opportunities in the economy to increase incomes for a large number of people. Transformative measures are more fundamental measures which are aimed at addressing concerns of justice and exclusion. This includes protection of socially vulnerable groups, and this especially works towards strengthening measures that will act against discrimination. Essentially, if you remember our previous lectures, the parameter of inequality to ensure that societies are not tremendously unequal based on caste or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or any other form of identity or material basis. Creating greater equality in a society would lead to structural transformation and reduce overall risks that people face from the economy. This approach is based on the premise that poverty and vulnerability are embedded in social and political structures. They are simply not derived from individual behavior or action. The aim is to create provisions that are more comprehensive and not residual. So this is also an example of a more universalist, more comprehensive measures of social protection and not a safety net. This diagram is, I hope you can see this diagram. This diagram essentially sketches the entire transformative social protection framework in terms of how does the promotion, the prevention and the provision, what does it look like and how does it actually contribute towards increasing social well-being. If you look at the provision box, you see the different kinds of instruments that are located in the provision box. For example, social assistance and other forms of coping strategies, both based on formal organizations and non-state actors like family and other informal networks. So social assistance provided by state and non-state actors can lead to transformation and social justice, but it can also lead to people getting promoted out of poverty. Examples of social assistance programs could be school feeding programs, so that children when they go to school are provided 2 square meals a day or 1 square meal a day so that they get nutritionally adequate diets and parents don't have to spend money on feeding them, and children are more attentive and they're healthier and they're able to attain better outcomes in education. Public works program is another example of a social assistance strategy that comes within this domain of provisioning. Through public works program, you can generate livelihood and employment and income in situations where poor people for certain times of the year maybe do not have access to any employment. Both school feeding and public works program are examples of social assistance which might lead to promoting people out of extreme poverty. Prevention, if you look at the box on prevention and how it helps to create both promotion and transformation, if you look at prevention, you see instruments such as insurance and diversification and mechanisms of other forms of mechanisms of social security. Examples of preventive mechanisms could be diversification of crops that farmers grow, encouraging migration and helping migrants to get legal status in whichever places they go to seek employment, creating better property rights, investing in microcredit programs. All of this would lead to economic opportunities and hence promoting people out of poverty. Another form of transformatory interventions could be giving farmers agricultural extension support and creating microfinance for women. Creating microfinance for women would lead to women having greater say in household decision making and more autonomy, and that would lead to societal transformation by reducing gender inequality in the society. Promotive and transformative aspects of social protection are also linked, because once people are promoted out of extreme poverty, various forms of other types of protection such as labor market regulation can help them to attain social justice by getting access to decent working condition. So hence this diagram tries to illustrate conceptually what we mean when we say that social protection is essentially about provisioning. It's about provisioning extremely poor people by giving them relief. It's by promoting people out of poverty, and it's also preventing poverty to happen in the first place. Let us look at the recent debates on creating a social protection floor globally. The concept of social protection floor is based on the premise of income transfer that would enable people to access basic services. In many countries, income transfer would enable people to benefit from better healthcare, primary education, and other critical services. In other contexts, income transfers need to be complemented with reducing other forms of non-financial barriers to access such services. In many developing country contexts, increasing access is usually insufficient because we do not have enough good quality facilities available for health and education in the first place. In such context, income transfers must be complemented by creating good quality and enough number of public or private services to provide people with the kind of commodities that we think are necessary for promoting social welfare. Social protection floor is a concept that has been floated by the ILO and the United Nations to ensure that, to mandate that all governments and all countries create a basic minimum precondition below which they do not allow their citizens to sink. There are various rival views to the social transformatory program of social protection. What are these views? There are instrumentalists and there are activists primarily. The instrumentalists believe that poverty causes dysfunctionality and hence they encourage risk management. So poverty is actually seen as a problem, and they think that it creates distortions in the market, and therefore private insurance players should be allowed to play a more important role so individuals can take responsibility to deal with the risks that they experience in their lives. Social activists, on the other hand, argue that poverty, inequality, etc. are byproducts of social injustice and call for citizen-oriented social protection measures such as universalism of welfare programs and not necessarily market-based mechanisms which people may or may not choose to buy. These two schools of thought differ on the instruments to be employed under social protection. For example, social pension or public works or targeted or universal coverage, which should be the best way to offer social protection. However, if we were to summarize this entire discussion briefly, it would mean that on the whole, it's good to have some social protection as against not having any social protection. When you have some social protection, it's good to have the most comprehensive coverage of social protection. Once we decide what this most comprehensive social protection coverage should be, then one needs to take decisions about where does the money come from and how do we address the most specific vulnerabilities, and also how to create preventive measures to ensure that people don't become so vulnerable in the first place. Let us look at the three broad instruments that are used in all social protection programs, irrespective of where they're being implemented or who's designing them. The first is social insurance. Social insurance programs are contribution, finance transfers of income or cash in kind. Here, entitlements are conditional on the payment or contribution. So if you are an employee who works for an organization, a formal organization, and you contribute a certain sum of the money that you earn every month as salary, and your employer contributes a certain proportion and the government contributes a certain proportion, and it ensures that you will have some safety net when you retire or if you fall sick. So that is a contributory social insurance. It provides protection against financial consequences of unemployment, old age, sickness, disability, maternity, and other life cycle or work-related contingencies. A very small proportion of workers in the formal sector are covered by social insurance in most countries. In other situations, you would have to you will simply not be covered by social insurance. So social insurance is a strategy that can also be created by government for all those people who don't work in formal sector. And that's where we come to social assistance. Social assistance consists of schemes or programs that provide income transfers and cash in kind to all those who are living in poverty or selected groups of people in the population who have been selected by the public authorities, the government or bureaucracy for some particular characteristics of vulnerability. Many of these schemes support access to social services or income generation. These are transfers that are made by a body unconditionally or with conditions, but it does not expect people to make contributions. Especially targets people working in the informal economy who do not have access to formal insurance systems. Rights-based social protection policies, which are also framed under an instrument of social assistance, can reduce poverty. An example of a social assistance program, can you think of an example, would be the subsidized food grains that are given to poorer people in the country through the public distribution system, so by the government in India. That is an example of a social assistance. People don't have to do anything or be anything. Yeah, they do have to be poor. Apart from that, they don't have to contribute anything to obtain the transfer of subsidized grain for them. Labor market and the family are the two other components that provide social protection. Labor and employment regulation ensures that basic and decent standards are maintained at workplace, which means that if your employer is respectful of labor standards and it follows the regulation of the country in which the organization is located, that essentially means that you will be protected against various types of harms because of a good labor regulatory standard that is available. You will learn more about this aspect of social protection in the module about labor laws in this course. Family and other informal networks, we learned a bit about them in our module on social capital. Effectiveness of informal social protection mechanisms is, however, reduced among communities that are extremely poor because the overall resource base of the community is very less in the first place. They have so little that it's very difficult for them to share it with other, even more disadvantaged members of such communities. Moreover, urbanization, aging, changing family structures, changing gender roles, and new types of shocks and crises that affect societies reduce the total pool of resources that families and other networks actually have to be able to contribute towards providing social protection informally to their family members. Despite this, to a great extent in countries like India, social protection is provided by families, neighbors, kins, and other forms of social support which is outside the formal bureaucracies and organizations. The role of the state is viewed as extremely important in the context of social policy and also in the context of social protection. Social protection instruments such as social insurance, social assistance, labor market standards originated in the European welfare states and has emerged in recent times in developing countries to address the social consequences of neoliberal policies in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, also in Latin America in the 1980s. The United Nations identifies the important role of the state in achieving universal social protection by financing, administering, and regulating social protection programs and institutions. While non-state actors do play an important role, replacing the state entirely for providing social protection mechanism will not be something that would work as an effective means to create well-being in the society. Let us take an example of a scheme that is implemented in India by the state government of Orissa, Ministry of Women and Child Development. The scheme is known as Vidya-mitra. It's a welfare scheme targeting pregnant women and lactating mothers. The objective is to improve the health of both mothers and children and reduce maternal and infant mortality rates in the state. It's a conditional cash transfer program which provides a monetary support of rupees 5,000 in 4 installments to pregnant and lactating women if they fulfill certain preset conditions linked to nutrition and health-seeking behavior. So what it does is, what has been the objective of Mamta? Why was this scheme created? Why is the government of Orissa transferring a cash amount to women who are pregnant or who have just given birth? The idea of the Mamta was a large number of poorer women are unable to care for themselves or for their children because they cannot ever stop working, because they would have to continue to labor through maternity and through the birth of their child because of their work in the informal sector or in agriculture, and therefore taking time off to look after themselves or to look after the infants would mean losing wages, and hence the Mamata was conceptualized to provide partial wage compensation for pregnant and nursing mothers, so that if they stayed at home to look after their babies, they will not, as a consequence, lose wages that would lead to reduced income for the families to which they belonged. It also sought to increase the utilization of maternal and child health services such as antenatal care, postnatal care, and immunization. And seeking of these services was made preconditional on obtaining the cash benefit under this scheme. The aim was also to improve mother and child care practices such as exclusive breastfeeding and complementary feeding of infants. Let us look at the conditionalities in obtaining this cash transfer. The scheme is implemented mainly through grassroots health workers, the Anganwadi, AWW, and A&M, the auxiliary nurse midwives. The first installment is paid at the completion of 6 months of pregnancy, provided the mother has met the following condition. The pregnancy has been registered at any one of the following places. The women who are about to give birth have to register their pregnancies at Anganwadi centers, public health centers, or any private doctors under JSY, which is another related central government scheme. Having received the folic acid and iron tablets, vaccinations, and antenatal checkup and counseling through home visit by health workers. Provided the women have fulfilled these two conditions, they are given the first installment of the cash transfer. The second installment is provided when the child is 3 months old. This is based on registration of the birth of the child and the child receiving immunization, the fact that the child's weight has been monitored, and the mother has also attended health and nutritional counseling sessions through the home visit by health workers. The objective of the Mamta scheme, therefore, is to ensure that maternal and child health outcomes improve by providing women with partial compensation for the wages they would lose if they took time off for maternity. This is an example of social assistance program. Now to conclude the module. In this module, what have we learned? You've been introduced to the concept of social protection and its relevance for social policy in contemporary times. You have learned about different frameworks of social protection and especially key instruments such as social insurance, social assistance, labor market standards, and informal networks of support. The module has ended with a case study that illustrated how social protection goals are being met through social assistance programs that target specific population groups and on particular types of issues. Thank you.